So thank you, panelists, and thank you, audience, for joining us all today for this panel discussion on equity, advocacy, and justice. I think it's notable that we don't say justice in STEM, because I think we will talk quite broadly in this conversation, although obviously we're going to bring in the relevance to STEM, but it's quite hard to discuss these things in isolation. So my name is Katie, my pronouns are she, her. I work at the University of Edinburgh as a project manager on a research project looking at equality, diversity and inclusion in STEM, or what we like to call it in what academia likes to call it, but we've decided to go a little bit more progressive with this panel today. My background is in anatomy and human genetics, and I did my PhD at Leeds University. And I'm now working more in professional services and coordination of projects at the university. I'm also the co-chair of the Pride Network at Edinburgh University, and that's given me a great insight into the sort of activism within academia relating to LGBT representation. And as a queer woman, it's something that's particularly personal to me as well. I'll pass over to Avery if you'd like to introduce yourself and then pick somebody after.
So I'm Avery Cunningham. I use he, him pronouns. I'm just about to start my Masters in Nuclear Decommissioning and Waste Management at the University of Birmingham. And outside of that, my work within LGBT STEM has mainly been with Alton STEM, where I currently hold the position of Regional Coordinator for New England and UK, amongst many other OSTEM related things I get up to. So, go by. Just next to my screen, so Tanmoy, do you want to go next?
Sure, thanks, Avery. My name is Tanmoy Laskar. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am a postdoctoral astrophysicist at the University of Bath in the UK, studying exploding stars. Prior to this, I was a postdoctoral fellow of the US National Radio Astronomy Observatory and UC Berkeley. My experiences are shaped by being a queer person of color who grew up in a homophobic society, specifically India. My undergraduate degree in physics in the UK as well, at the University of Cambridge, together with the corresponding cultural shocks, and almost 10 years in the US, including Baltimore, Boston, and San Francisco. I'm especially passionate about education, community building through science and the arts. I'm a composer and choir director, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM. Most recently, I've been working to understand the concept of justice and what that means for science and science education in today's society. So I was really excited to see that as one of the topics of today's panel discussion. So many thanks to the STEM Village for really a fantastic symposium so far and for setting up this conversation. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Clau, would you like to go next?
Sure. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you all. It's amazing. This event has been absolutely fantastic. So thanks to everyone involved. So my name is Claudia Nader Jaime. Everyone just calls me Clau for practical purposes. And I'm a Mexican Lebanese queer in STEM/arts as well. I'm based at the University of York at the moment. I'm doing a PhD exploring sound interventions for mental health in adolescents. More specifically ASMR, which people seem to like. I don't, but you know. And yeah, so I come, like my original circle is actually very conservative and very traditional. The Mexican Lebanese community in Mexico. I was born in Mexico. My dad's family were refugees from Lebanon in Mexico at the start of the last century. So I was raised in a very conservative way and in a very traditional way, but I consider myself really privileged because within my context I had access to education, which is not it's not the case for everyone back home. So that has given me the opportunity to kind of like see different things and open my eyes to human rights and advocacy and social justice. And now that I've had the opportunity to jump across the pond and be here in England, obviously I've gone like Tanmoy says, like through different cultural shocks, obviously, but it's been great to finally feel safe to be able to do some activism, because sometimes in different cultures or different conflicted areas, you cannot like be active for social justice because you're like risking your life literally. So being here is a total privilege, and I just want to use this platform to, you know, reflect on either queer people or non-queer people, or just anyone that needs to have a platform or a safe space so they can, you know, be themselves and just do whatever they want to do and try to educate other people within, you know, a safe boundary or like a safe bubble. Yeah. How about we go with Izzy?
Thank you again to STEM Village and to the other panelists for including me in this discussion. I'm going to keep it really short because I've already had an opportunity to speak this morning and have a good rant. But briefly to introduce myself, I'm Izzy Jayasinghe, pronouns Sheilihar. I work in the University of Sheffield as a senior research fellow, and I also have worked in the last few years with a number of different organizations championing equality, diversity, and inclusion. Not so much justice exactly, but I guess I come from a background of being a trans woman of color, of Asian descent, having been born in a war-torn country like Sri Lanka, and having lived in 4 different countries and worked in 5 different universities in the last decade. So I've seen different variations of practice of EDI, and I guess in that process I've also been an immigrant and have observed what it's like to be privileged from both sides of that story, to be privileged and to not have the privilege. So in a nutshell, that's who I am. Shall I put Jess on the spot now?
Thank you. I'm really pleased to be on this panel with such amazing folks. I'm Jess. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a white, bisexual, fat American woman. I was the first in my family to go to university, was raised by a single mom. Both my father and my brother's father spent time in prison. And I think for me, there was no expectation that coming from that background meant that I would go to university, let alone get a PhD. I'm an educational sociologist focused on inequalities in higher education, which means I'm a bit of an interloper as a non-STEM person. And I've worked in the US and UK for 20 years in higher education, especially focused on inequalities. And I'm really excited to be part of a 2-person duo with STEM Equals. So I'll pass it over to Marco.
So thanks, Jess. We know each other very well. I'm Marco. My pronouns are he and him. I'm a gay, queer, white Italian man, currently based in Glasgow after living many years in Japan. This seemed to be a little bit of a topic today, and I was pleased about that. There I did my PhD. My background is a little bit mixed in civil engineering and architecture. And currently I'm working at the STEM Equals project with Jess. So if you want to know more about what we do, follow us on Twitter at STEM Equals and check our first year report. We just released that. So if you want to know about our activities, have a read.
Great, thank you everyone. I should note that myself and Avery are going to be chairing this session. I'm going to be facilitating the majority of the conversation as we go along. And Avery is going to be monitoring the questions submitted from the audience. So as we go, we're going to start by breaking down the session into sort of 3 parts. So we're going to start by focusing on what equity means, and then we'll have some questions from the audience. So as we go along in the conversation, please post questions or share thoughts, and that will help guide our conversation in addition to the guidance that we've already got planned. And then we'll go into advocacy and do the same, where we'll have more questions together and from the audience, and then finally finishing with a discussion around justice and what that means to us. And when I was thinking about this discussion and how to bring it together, I did a sort of cursory looking up of what these words mean. And I think these words can mean quite different things to different people, and our understandings of these words vary a lot. And I think it can be influenced by our life experience. And we have a great panel here who bring a real breadth of life experience to the situation that we're discussing. Equity, if you look it up, just doing a cursory Google search, it says the quality of being fair and equal. And in many ways, this doesn't necessarily go far enough. And I think it echoed one of the reasons why the organisers of STEM Village wanted to use the word equity instead of just equality, and how important it is to go this extra step when we want to be thinking about what these words mean and what they represent. Clau, I wondered if you would like to kick us off with some thoughts around this and why it's important that we are talking about equity here.
Sure. Well, I think when we talk about equity, we're automatically implying intersectionality. So it's not as easy as just like offer equal opportunities for everyone, because everyone needs something different, right? Like just quoting a scientist that I really admire, Dr. Poppy Crum. She's a technologist, and she says how the same size fits all. It doesn't work, because we come from a different background, we have different needs, and we literally have different neuroplasticity depending on the background and the environment that we grow up in. So when we talk about equity, we're trying to give to people whatever people need individually, rather than just like offering the same to everyone, because that might not be what people need. Is that more or less, yeah?
Yeah, thank you. No, that's really, really useful insights. Tanmoy, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, so I think that equality is this sort of Orwellian concept that is presented as a global ideal, as one that all institutions in society should aspire to. The idea being that fundamentally human beings are created equal, and so given equal opportunities, they should be able to sculpt and develop their lives to the maximum personal satisfaction. Unfortunately, I think this is a myopic view of reality, where our social and economic background impacts the course of our lives even before we are born. So I believe it's not sufficient to just provide equal access and equal opportunities and be need blind and colorblind in today's world, where some communities have suffered decades, if not centuries, of marginalization. And the impact of this can't be undone simply by providing opportunities and hoping that magically these communities will contribute to the fullest of their potential. I think equity, as Clau so eloquently stated, turns this around, and it's a step toward justice. Equity, to me, states that we will meet people where they are. We will recognize that different individuals have different needs based on their lived experiences that must be fulfilled for everyone to get the maximum from the opportunities that we provide them. So equity, to me, is acknowledging that there is never a one-size-fits-all solution. It's recognizing that a person's historical and cultural background is relevant to their work. And it's allowing, encouraging, and supporting them in being who they are and whom they want to be. At its core, I think equity needs empathy so that we can open our hearts and minds to everyone's needs. It needs respect for everyone's unique situations. It needs curiosity to learn what we can do. And then it needs an understanding that not everything is going to be perfect, but the first thing we have to do is observe and listen, metaphorically speaking. We have to think, and we have to try to make a difference.
Thank you. It's brilliantly concise, actually, and gives us a real solid foundation for what we're trying to talk about here and where we're heading towards in terms of looking through this process of going from equity, advocacy, and into justice. Something I think about when we're considering notions of equity is that in academia, something that gets touted quite a lot is this notion of academia as a meritocracy. People are very wedded to this, and I bring this up a lot because it was something I only learnt quite recently, was that the word meritocracy was actually coined as a way of satirizing this notion that everybody being judged on their merits is something that's actually possible. It's not possible because people bring in their biases. I'll go to Jess first of all to comment on this, because I imagine within STEM Equals, this is something that you talk about a lot in terms of how people are experiencing STEM as a career and academia more broadly.
It's definitely come up a lot in STEM Equals, particularly from participants. So we had 82 participants in our first phase, interviewees and focus group participants. And there's some folks who understandably want to say, well, it's equal. I, as a woman, will be judged only on my accomplishments. So I think that there's this pushback against the kind of work that needs to be done to address the injustices folks are actually facing. But by the numbers, it's demonstrably incorrect. We see, in the data that has been talked about all day today, the inequalities that a lot of folks face with research funding, with applying for jobs. So I think that the idea of meritocracy sounds like what you want to believe it is. So we want to believe that we're only going to be judged on the excellence of our research, on the skills and experience and knowledge that we bring. But that's not true. And we wish it was. And maybe that's why we push back against the idea that the work needs to be done, or that we need any kind of different kinds of supports to enable us to have a fair playing field. So I think that has definitely shown in our research, but I think that shows a lot in even one of the questions that was asked today, which was, how do we convince people if they won't be convinced by the data? So you can talk about mountains of data and still have someone say, I don't believe you, which is like, well, this isn't my opinion, this is facts, this is data. You can tell me that you have an opinion about pineapple on pizza, but you can't tell me that you disbelieve that systemic inequalities exist. So I think that's part of the problem is we want to believe meritocracy is real when it's not.
Thank you. I was just curious to pick up on data as a concept, because particularly in your position, Jess, as a social scientist coming into a field working with scientists, what's been your experience around the respect for different kinds of data and because you quote this sort of pushback of people not believing, and I wonder if that's related to people having certain values about data.
Yeah, there's definitely a divide on what's seen as real research, quote unquote real research, and what's accepted as real research. And we want a lot of numbers, and actually often what I'll do is I'll present numbers first before stories, which I think is unfortunate because I don't like seeing numbers presented only. So if we're not also talking about qualitative data, which is people's real experiences, then I think we're missing a huge part of the story. But also this pushback against what makes real research. It must be robust. Of course it should be robust, but what are you defining as robust? And it must be replicable. Well, a lot of individuals are experiencing serious intersectional compounded inequalities. And so how are we going to replicate that when individuals are often experiencing it so uniquely and differently? But even in the face of presenting like large scale studies and proving time and again that inequalities and discriminations are impacting people's lives and their careers, I mean, we still have that pushback. I gave a talk a few weeks ago about the intersections, or at least the connections between inequalities in higher education and mental health. And there was an anonymous comment that said that all this data does not prove anything because systemic inequality isn't real. And it's like, so that was one comment out of whatever 35 or 40 people that were attending, but it's sort of like, I'm probably not going to convince that person. But I also think, and Marco and I noticed when we went to, for example, LGBT Seminar, which was a stellar event, there was a few times when there was folks either disparaging other sciences and engineering or other STEM fields, or disparaging social science as not real. To the point where there was a session where someone shouted out that Meg John Barker's work isn't real because they are a psychologist, and which is like wild, because how have you not heard of their name? But yeah, so I think there's a minority of folks who won't believe the data because they want to believe meritocracy already exists. And there's also folks who I think are perpetuating this idea that some research is more valuable than others, and that we definitely see that in equality and diversity research.
Thank you. Picking up on the notion of some research being better than others, and I'm conscious that we're sort of slightly going down the track of actually talking about inequality here, and these are behaviours that enhance inequalities when you try and put yourself above somebody else in that sort of quite direct, overt way. Well, these experiences are obviously so crucial and they are happening. What can we do to challenge it? I'll go to Izzy first for your thoughts.
Thanks for that. I hope you can hear me because there was a comment that my audio wasn't loud.
Yes, it's still a little quiet, actually.
For some reason, it's been quiet in the afternoon. I'll speak up as loudly as I can.
Thank you.
I think that the challenging opposition to this, to presenting data or presenting an argument or presenting experiences of people is really a part of it. Is really recognizing that we are up against an opposition, a large demographic of people who benefit from the status quo, and there's rational discussion, but there's bound to be irrational discussion, and I think it's quite important to kind of filter out the difference between kind of cynical comments and a real sort of in-depth discussion. Is that the question that you asked, Katie? Am I?
No, I was going on the lines of how to challenge things, and I think actually you've gone a step further there by suggesting, by breaking it down and giving us this sense of actually what is worth acknowledging and what is actually sort of beneficial, if I've paraphrased correctly there.
Yeah, so if I understand correctly, I think one of the critical things is that when you're having a discussion, you do need to try and keep that discussion engaged, unless it's going off track. And I've said in the past that it's important to sort of persevere with people who perhaps come from a point of naivety or a lack of understanding. So it's really, I think, as people who spend a bit of time understanding the data and looking at the data, we have a responsibility to sort of stay in the conversation. And it just comes down to a couple of very basic fundamentals like patience and kindness. I have talked about this in the past, and I think I have agreed to disagree with people that how can you continue to have a conversation with someone like a climate change denier or a TERF who is fundamentally opposed to the concept of inclusion and equality or equity. And I think there has to be a certain level of kind of effort to engage in that conversation, but then obviously if that conversation is harming you as an individual, then it's better to step back. If that's perhaps answering the question.
Yes, thank you. I think that concept of stepping back is really crucial, particularly when we get to a point where a conversation is no longer productive, and actually you're probably not actually talking about the same thing anymore because all you're doing is giving this person a platform to continue saying hateful things. And being cognizant of that is quite difficult when you're in the moment. I want to circle onto a concept that comes up in STEM, but I think it's relevant to research as well, and then which is the notion of open science and how science has to be something that isn't done in the absence of the people who have the lived experience. And in all of your introductions, you shared your lived experience of the world and where your backgrounds are and how valuable that is. And I think that's something that concepts like meritocracy ignore because they have this notion, these things aren't relevant to what we're doing. And we're trying to move towards this notion of open science and open research. Marco, I wondered if you could comment on the importance of that in your role in STEM Equals and perhaps more broadly.
Yeah, I think this is a very, very important question and a very important notion because to advance equity in the workplace or in any social setting. And we are very far from here because if we think about how institution like university works, usually there are all these policies drafted by EDI teams where very few, if no representative from affected groups are, these people are not included usually in the discussion. And this is not effective at all, leads to poor decision, waste time and money of everybody. So on a different scale, like there's a great example me and Jess usually refer to explain, the advantage of having a more diverse platform of people involved, which is probably you're aware of that, this soap dispenser designed in the States. So you can see this on YouTube. So there's this soap dispenser that only works when there are white hands. So if you have black hands, you receive no soap. So what does that mean? What does that show to us? That probably there was no people of color, no BAME individual consulted or part of the process from design, prototyping, testing, nothing. How is that even possible? How much time has been wasted? How much money has been wasted there? So we need definitely to have a more diverse, research environment, work environment, because this is what, this is more equitable, but it also leads to better results.
Thank you. I think we might have a question from the audience now. Avery, would you like to read it out for us? Thank you.
Sure, yeah, we've got two. I'll go with the first one. So how can we convince people about the fallacy, the meritocracy, while some of our political leaders strongly deny it? I'd like to take this first.
That's a very interesting one. I will go back to Tanmoy for this one.
That is a tough one, and the question is, where do you even start with a concept like meritocracy? There are so many layers here, because as I am going through my research career, I'm learning more and more about what aspects of science actually function as a quasi-meritocracy versus what are the various other aspects of science that or working in academia, which is my field, which nobody tells you, nobody teaches you, which you have to learn as you go through the process. What is actually important in addition to getting good data, writing good research papers, or whatever else you think when you start, say, a program, say a PhD program. So I think the first thing that needs to happen is there needs to be clarity at all levels as to what is actually valued by institutions for hiring, for promotion, where we clearly list the requirements at every stage and stick to those. That also raises the question of unconscious biases, where we need to ensure that none of those are actually at play. And it's a very difficult task, and it's a long-term process. So we have to, first of all, sort through our institutional systems to make sure that the way they are set up are actually equitable to everybody. And then in terms of the leaders who deny these things, I guess if they're elected leaders, then the question is vote based on what you think their platforms are. And if they're not elected leaders, then the solution there is advocacy, which I think is the next step that we'll get to.
Thank you. You've brilliantly segued us into the next topic, and I'm aware there is another question relating to this, but we'll pick up on any additional questions if there is time at the end, and if not, we can go on to Twitter as well and try and address further questions. But thank you so much so far for the participation from the audience. Moving on to advocacy then. In terms of a sort of notional generic definition, what came up was that this is to do with public support for recommendation of a particular cause or policy. Now, obviously, what we're talking about here is equity and justice, and how we advocate for those things, and how we make them part of the system that we're all existing in, which is the system of largely in academia or research more broadly, but you can't really separate this from the wider world as well. I'll go to Clau again, because you bring quite an international perspective on this. How important is this concept of advocacy, do you think?
I think it's important to understand that not everyone can be active. So not everyone can be an active advocate. if they are not safe, for example. So first of all, we need to, in my opinion, build like a safe network where we can actually make things visible without risking our lives, basically. And also, like, if we're talking about intersectional activism, we need to consider as well that potential allies, we need to have like an intersectional approach as well, because we all come from different cultures, different political views, different religions. So we need to adequate the speech or adequate the message depending on what culture we're speaking to. So people can understand from within their context and within their values and their cultural context, can understand about human rights and about how they can, you know, like just like defend human. We're not like asking to defend a religion per se. We're just asking to defend the right of someone to have a religion. You know, it's the same for someone to have the right to identify with X or Z gender. So I think in order to be an advocate, first we need to be safe, because if we're not safe, we cannot do anything really. And also allies need to, we need to open the space. We need to make things visible in order to tackle them, obviously. But then we need to give a safe space for allies as well. And give like a safe space so people can ask questions, so people can make mistakes, because we don't know it all. We're not born like knowing it all, and everyone's learning. So I think it's a learning process where people, like, we all need to be patient as well and compassionate, because when, you know, like, we just come from different places and we don't have like the same concepts of everything. So obviously everything's linked to justice, everything's linked to equity. But in order to kind of boost advocacy, I think we need to keep it intersectional and just try to build safe networks.
I think that concept of safety is really crucial. And I think it's something that often gets overlooked, particularly in organizations that are majority white, because we don't necessarily experience threats to our safety in the same way, particularly in the UK, where we don't have the same kind of legislations against people's identities, particularly LGBT identities. Though this isn't strictly true at present, because we are in an ongoing process of reforming the Gender Recognition Act, and this is something that's come up a lot, both in the public sphere and in academia, because there are people that have tried to champion the right to use their academic freedom to say particularly hateful things about trans identities. I think the notion of academic freedom is something that we might want to explore briefly, because advocacy is about using your platform, and it's about recognizing the importance of that. Izzy, I wondered if you could comment on academic freedom broadly and maybe more specifically. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. I hope the sound's a bit better now. I have adjusted a few things. So academic freedom is, I guess, you know, what a lot of us in academia enjoy about academia, to be able to think freely. But I think it's been, again, like many other terms, been the meaning of that term academic freedom has been sort of distorted. So things like bigotry, hatred, exclusionary language has been sort of disguised as academic freedom for a lot of these debates that have come around. But I think we also have a fairly robust system in academia whereby if someone is actually distorting the meaning of a term, of a concept, we speak out. And we saw examples of that last year when there was a small group of, you know, elite academics who used the term academic freedom as a way to kind of punch down on trans rights and non-binary rights, and they wanted to have the freedom to actually, use hate speech in their workplaces, which was not acceptable. And we saw responses from academics across the UK and around the world in the form of a few open letters that were published in newspapers. So I think we have, at the moment, we have a situation where we can have that conversation, although this conversation seems to reiterate itself. But what is perhaps dangerous is then in the attempts to stifle that conversation and call it cancel culture, which really isn't really what they say it is. Cancel culture in the minds of people who call it that is any opposition to bigotry and hatred that they are ready to say out loud. So I think cancel culture is a myth. Academic freedom is a real thing, but at the same time, we all have to live up to a certain standard that we practice academic freedom without excluding or hurting other people, in my view.
Thank you. I want to bring us on to the...
Sorry, can I add on to that?
Yes, please, Jess.
That was excellent. I think I was thinking as you were speaking, Izzy, about whose academic freedom is protected or is allowed to be platformed. Thinking here about the ways that particularly politicians on the right keep talking about freedom of speech under threat at universities, which it's not. But also there's been a lot of discussion for years about actual freedom of speech being under threat by Prevent, and the ways that Prevent is chilling speech and certainly impacting academic freedom for Muslim and staff and students, for students and staff of color. And I think thinking about who gets to claim that their academic freedom is under threat looks very white and very privileged, and whose academic freedom, which is actually under threat, is ignored for years, is quite telling.
I can add an example to that. I was actually involved in a panel. I'm not going to say when or where, but the panel was organized by a junior colleague in a UK university. And they felt compelled to have a meeting before the date of the panel, just to make it aware to us that they are under instructions from the leadership of the university not to use the term racism, and to replace the word racism with discrimination. So I think that is an example of freedom of speech being really stifled, and where academic freedom has been eroded. So yeah.
If we had endless amounts of time, I'm sure there are countless other anecdotes that we could all share where we've had perspectives stifled because we challenge the status quo. As I was saying, I'd like to try and bring the conversation onto allyship briefly, because I think this is quite closely linked to advocacy. To be an advocate, you're often standing as an ally to a community that isn't necessarily your own. And particularly within the LGBT community, it's often really important that we are allies to each other, as well as needing straight allies. Tanmoy, I wondered if you could talk about this for a moment, please.
Yeah, thanks for that. I wanted to pick up from what Klaus said earlier about allies and bring those two concepts together. So I've been personally working in many areas of diversity and inclusion for about 11 years now, first as a science and LGBT tutor at Harvard College, then as an advisor on climate in the workplace. And I've served on civil diversity and equity committees, and I'm sure many of us have. And I've written and published on these issues. I'm personally happy to do this because these issues are close to my heart. But I, like everyone else on this panel, I'm just one person. And there is only so much we can do without burning out. So I think we have to find ways to make this process sustainable. And that means getting allies off the cheerleader stands and into the fields to do the work with us. And I think we may talk more about this when we get to the topic of justice. But for me, this means convincing our colleagues that advocacy is important, equipping them with some of the tools that we use that they can adopt. And Clara mentioned some of this earlier. Convincing them that this is a worthwhile endeavor, and also combating cultural taxation, which is this tax on URM communities for supporting themselves, and is actually a whole other conversation. I personally like Professor Paul Miller's classification of allies, specifically framed as different kinds of leaders in higher education. Professor Miller says that there are those kinds of allies who are indifferent, then there are those who are passive sympathizers, then there are performative sympathizers, and the issue of performative allyship we may also get to when we talk about justice. And then there are the accidental activists who don't have clear plans, and finally there are the deliberate activists. And this last group shows clear personal commitment and planned interventions. And I think that is what we need allies to be. So what does being an ally mean? I think to me, being an ally means knowing the concerns of persons with marginalized identities, first of all, making their fight your fight, and working shoulder to shoulder with them to get them the support they need, so that we can have a better functioning society for everyone. It means also knowing one's own privileges and what they mean. And then it means recognizing the power that our individual platforms have, and then owning that power to then affect systemic change at all levels.
Thank you. It's such a crucial notion, and as well, I think it's really great that you brought in this concept of activism too, because the action and making real moves and doing actual things is really important in a role as an ally or an advocate for something. I think it was a student that once said to me that they prefer the term accomplice than ally, which made me seem like people were in like little bands of activists, I suppose, going around doing things. I'm going to move us into the topic of justice now, because I'm conscious of the time, and this is something that I think has a lot of falsehoods around the understanding of what this means, because we use the word justice usually in the general population to talk about, people getting what they deserve or getting the treatment that they're entitled to or something like that, and it's largely shaped by experiences within the justice system, so which we have in this country and in many other countries, which often isn't just in any way, and it was something that we discussed in advance of this event. Jess, I wondered if you wanted to pick up on this a bit more.
Yeah, I think I was thinking back to Izzy's keynote when she introduced the work by Tony Ruth on what equity means, and also then again what justice means. And I also think, and I've mentioned before, I think that folks, like you were saying, they think it's about what you deserve. And of course, there's a lot of bias about who is deserving or not deserving. So for me, when I think about people's, some folks' understanding of justice, it's shaped a lot by the belief that the world is inherently just. So if you're not familiar with the just world fallacy or the just world theory, I think that a lot of our inherent notions about what justice should look like is absolutely shaped by bias. And we can see that in some basic examples. So for example, we still ask people who have survived sexual violence, we still ask what were they wearing? Were they drinking? And those aren't relevant questions ever. But we ask those questions. I mean, we don't individually on this panel ask those questions, but those questions are asked when someone comes forward as a survivor, because there's a belief that if you behaved a certain way, if you dressed a certain way, you would have avoided the assault, which is ridiculous. And it places the blame then on the person receiving the assault. And we do this a lot with other justice issues. So we look to, what have you not done then in your career? That's why you haven't gotten further in your career. What have you not done? That's why you didn't get that research funding. As opposed to, why is it that out of the millions of pounds just given by UKRI, none of them went to Black researchers? It's not the Black researchers. So it's thinking about how our notions of justice are misshapen by our biases, and sort of reflecting on how that impacts what we think is right when it comes to justice work.
Thank you, Jess, and thank you for bringing up I'm going to call it a controversy around the UKRI funding. So this, to expand a little bit, just briefly, the UKRI recently awarded £4.3 million of funding to research the impact of COVID on BAME communities, because it's been widely shown that BAME communities are disproportionately affected by COVID. Of this £4.3 million of funding, no pounds were awarded to Black academics. So no people leading on this research are Black academics. And an open letter was shared by Dr. Adeline, along with authored by her and 9 other Black women, effectively calling out this injustice. And progress is being made in terms of conversations that are ongoing between Addy and the UKRI. And I wanted to pose this question to the panel as to what would justice look like in this situation. You can go as blue sky as you want. I'll come to Izzy first.
I think justice, to start with, would look like an apology, a sincere apology, because it wasn't just the failure to award funding, but it was also the pushback and the denial and the gaslighting that went on social media following that from a small number of individuals. So admitting to that problem is a good starting point, but also a real commitment, and one that we can trust that they will follow through to kind of again make it equitable in the future funding rounds to right the wrongs in this mistake that they've made. So I think there's a short-term solution, and the COVID research funding will probably have a finite time limit. And I think what justice would look like from the UKRI in the short term is to try and give those opportunities and give that funding to applicants and researchers who are deserving, who are from BAME backgrounds, who have been disadvantaged in this situation.
Thank you. Marco, I'm conscious we haven't heard from you from the previous session. I wondered if you wanted to comment further on what justice would look like in this example, if there is any more long-term things that you could see that would be just in terms of maybe more broadly in terms of funding awards.
I mean, yeah, if I had the answer for this, it would be great. This is such a complex problem, obviously, and our project, your project, Inclusion Matters project, exists also because of this problem. I think Izzy said it very perfectly. I don't have anything to really add there. What I can say broadly in terms of justice, I really agree with what Izzy said this morning, seeing justice as an aspiration in a way, but we have to be conscious that we live in a world that is deeply unjust, but at the same time, we as LGBTQ people, for example, we live in a world that is better than the world that older generation of LGBT people faced. So justice is also a movement toward something better. So if we keep pushing toward justice, things will get better. Obviously, there's never going to be anything as perfect justice in the world, but we have to keep pushing.
Thank you. I think bringing in that concept of this being a movement and it's not something that stops necessarily, I think it's quite clear with it being very difficult to come up with an answer for what justice really looks like. It's because I'll go back to a talk I saw a couple of years ago by an academic who said that we've never seen what equality looks like. Equality is the apocalypse. We can't fully imagine that, and so we have to keep moving, and we can't stop when we make bits of progress. We need to keep going towards what is justice. Izzy, did you want to come in on that?
I just wanted to highlight a comment that's come through in the chat thread from Caroline. The fact that there was no data collected in this process. And I think the data could be a guiding metric to achieving justice. It's not something that's infinitely out there.
Absolutely. And it brings me on to the next concept I wanted to bring in, which is what tools we have to keep this movement going, and data is clearly one of them, giving us this better understanding. There are tools that have existed for a while now that are designed to improve equality or to improve equity in STEM, such as Athena Swan. Now there has this is an initiative that has been criticised because it's now being shown that it hasn't actually benefited people as well as it should have. And Tanmoy, I know when we were discussing ahead of this that you had some thoughts on Athena Swan.
Yeah, so I'll build this into a series. So you mentioned that justice is a movement. And so one of the questions we can ask is what gets in the way of justice? What prevents, what reduces momentum of justice? And I'll build Athena Swan in as an example. So to answer the previous question that we were talking about, what is justice? Justice to me means a society where systems are not systematically rigged to benefit a certain population. That is my definition of justice. I think it's a tall order. It needs participation at every level. It's a long-term thing, and it's a bit like it's a bit like climate change. Like we need there's an urgent need to act now. Small efforts add up. Big changes are possible, and we need everybody to pitch in and do something. So what are some things we can do, and what gets in the way of justice? So in my mind, there are four big factors. There's denial, there's ineptitude, fragility or bargaining, and complacency. And I'll briefly talk on each of these four. So denial, of course, is the most frustrating at the beginning, but perhaps in some ways the easiest to address. As Izzy mentioned at the first talk today, dealing with denial requires the provision of data to demonstrate that A, there is a systemic problem, and B, that it is in everyone's best interest to fix it. Unfortunately, lots of civilized societies choose to live in this zone, and trying to change the status quo can result in you getting killed, which is something that Claudia mentioned earlier. So I believe that that sort of situation requires a combination of mass mobilization and peer pressure. And that's what will work there. Ineptitude can be either, I don't think this is an important problem to tackle, or this is not what we need to focus on right now, or even perhaps, I don't know where to start. Here, one of the solutions can be to take a leadership role and flag the issue, highlight its importance, and if obvious, present a solution. So I work in this zone all the time, and my weapon of choice, especially in this current pandemic world, is the email. So no matter how small the issue, if it can be raised, I raise it and provide a reason for why I think it's worth raising in a non-threatening way and provide suggestions. Then there's fragility, which gets in the way, or bargaining. And this is something that I have just recently discovered is a thing. It's a statement that I am not the problem, and perhaps look at all the ways in which I've been helping. The problem is that this can sort of sidestep the issue at hand and make it really difficult to address. So I'm still learning how to deal with this in other people. But for me, early on, the key was realizing that I'm going to make mistakes, but that I just need to learn from those mistakes and move on. And not let that stop me from trying in the first place. So that requires a certain level of introspection and humility, but we just have to accept that we are all in this together. And then finally, getting to Athena Swan, that's the fourth point of complacency. And that's the attitude of doing one small thing and calling it a victory when the majority of the problem remains unaddressed. So Athena Swan, of course, is a benchmark scheme for gender equality in the UK. And there's, of course, the very real and well-known problem that women are underrepresented in STEM fields. The issue is that the Athena Swan scheme lets institutions find a box to tick. And these same institutions are obsessed with getting a high Athena Swan score, while slashing the budgets of their diversity or race relations or gender identity and sexual orientation support networks. So in doing this, they forget the importance of intersectionality and of people's lived experiences. So we need to, and we can fight this, I think, by raising the alarm at the institutional level and finding ways to make our voices heard by people in positions of power.
Thank you. That's really useful insight into the sort of constructs that surround how we build this movement for justice and the real barriers that we're facing and how to dismantle those barriers. I've really appreciated having all of your insights today. We have a question that we didn't address from earlier, which was about how the word equality is such a buzzword, and it's something that we're quite wedded to, I think, in the STEM community and more broadly in academia. Is there a way that we can move towards the concept of equity, even while this word is still around? Do you think we're challenged by having these words and being so wedded to the definitions of them? I'll come back to Clau. Thank you.
I guess it's a matter of time as well, and perseverance, because as Marco said, this is a movement, and we're constantly adapting to a level of consciousness. Like humans, we're not an exact science. We're more than numbers, and we evolve. So all these concepts just keep evolving through time. So I think what we're doing right here, opening this safe space to talk about this, to make it visible, to use social media platforms, to use higher education institutions, to use the industry or the corporate industry as a platform through our privilege, I think that's like a first step. And for example, going back to what Craig said in the morning about like related to climate change, that we need to listen to people. So if we create these safe spaces, we need to be aware that, as Tanmoy said earlier, we come from like a defined background, and we can only speak from our experience. So we need to listen to other people. So I think opening to just like learning this other concepts, I think it's like a good way to start. For example, we talk about BAME, and that term has been going for a while now, but a lot of people don't identify with that term. And for example, here in York, there's a new collective, the York Anti-Racist Collective. We are discussing, for example, to use a new term, and it's people experiencing collective racism, for example, instead of BAME. Why? Because there's white people that also experience racism within minorities, for example, the Gypsies, or other people in Eastern Europe, for example. So I think it's about this discussions and yeah, like being open and not being scared to contribute. And as you were saying before, like make mistakes, because we're just learning here, and we're just like making our best, really.
Yeah, and I think this concept of making mistakes is something that people need to embrace a lot more. I think, the notion of expertise and perfection gets fetishized almost in academia, and you avoid failure, but actually we learn so much more through failure and when things go wrong. And science as a thing is something that adjusts its views in light of new evidence. So we should be able to move in our understanding of things. And I think if we can continue this movement, there's real hope for progress. I'm just going to finish by thanking you all again for sharing your insights today. It's been hugely valuable, and I've learned a lot myself, and hopefully the everyone watching has appreciated too. So thank you all for your time, and I'll speak again soon. Bye bye.